Well, can you take more? Well, first of all, I would like to thank the UCL and CEAS for doing this. And as Professor Hazelwood said, there is a strong link between my country and CEAS. And as a matter of fact, the picture you see here on the screen is of Havel's first visit to CEAS in March 1990, when he came to Britain for the first time and was received by the Prime Minister and the Queen, and also by CEAS. Well, I'm somewhere here outside. Now, as Tim has already mentioned, we discussed the subject last week at Oxford, and as I was thinking about what to say today, I felt a certain distaste, which was rather Havelesque, I must say, and that I had been quite familiar with when I worked with Havel as a spokesman and had to agonize with him over every new statement, every new speech, and every new interview. Unlike most politicians who base their trade on repeating the same things over and over again, and in boilerplate op-eds, in prepared statements, Havel's sensibility was always that of a writer. And he strongly felt that he would be inauthentic, false, and also boring if he ever repeated something he already said or wrote. So something of that I feel today, when Havel, not even 2 months after his death, appears to me at least to run the risk of being transformed into a monument engraved in stone, a saintly figure who elevated the power of the powerless to a political method, who spent his life living in truth, and who was one of the great visionaries of our times. I feel that by repeating what I said last week, even if I could remember it all, I would be contributing to the petrification of someone who was vastly more complex, more interesting, and more intellectually challenging than that. So I will, I don't know what I will do. But it is a typical Havelesque dilemma. If I said something completely different from what I said last week, I couldn't be talking about the same person. I would have to start recalling or worse, reinventing things about Havel that I didn't feel very important last week. Or on the contrary, correcting memories or reinventions of the last week. But underneath all his complexity, Havel was always the same person, recognizable, largely consistent, and to a degree predictable. After more than 10 years of being the president, and I think Tim has touched upon whether he overstayed his welcome or not, despite his sensibility of a writer, even he couldn't avoid repeating himself and saying the same things all over again, very much to his displeasure. But anyway, so at the risk of being rambling and repetitive at the same time, let me concentrate on 3 concepts that both Tim and Jacques mentioned, which seem to me to distinguish Havel from most other politicians, and which to me comprises lasting significance. But power of the powerless is the first, and both Tim and Jacques talked about it. Havel was certainly not the first thinker who realized the political potential of non-violent resistance and civil disobedience. He followed in the traditions of Gandhi, of Martin Luther King, of Nelson Mandela, and other heroes of civil or human rights struggle, in some cases once they turned away from violent confrontation. What made his treatment of the idea, which is best elaborated in the Power of the Powerless essay, so powerful, it's an unintended pun, was his awareness of the intrinsic, comprehensive nature of the totalitarian, and even of the post-totalitarian, as he called it, system, which differs from other dictatorships and authoritarian regimes in that it was always more than a sum of its parts, that it was the ultimate gestalt, which was only capable of functioning in its totality or not at all. Under these circumstances, as Havel shows in his brilliant analysis of the grocer who puts up a meaningless sign attesting to his loyalty to the system, the simple and not even too heroic act of refusing to participate in the self-enforcing rituals of the system changes into a nuclear weapon that sooner or later brings the whole edifice down. It should be added as a corollary that this approach, which was instrumental in the triumph of the Velvet Revolution, is not nearly as practical as an instrument of governing, as Havel came to recognize in his presidential days, when the power of the powerless often changed into the powerlessness of power. Quite recently, he told me that he relished his experience as a film director in leaving the film that he made 3 years ago, that he relished it so much that this was one time where everyone on the set obeyed his instructions. It was very different in politics. In Havel's reliance on the authentic, spontaneous, responsible action by people as individuals, there was little room for political machines, organized campaigns, political marketing, and stable support mechanisms that would help him achieve his goals. And some of his disappointments and failures during his presidential phase were in large part a consequence of that. Now, the second concept I would like to focus on briefly is the concept of living in truth. And again, in its simplified and simplistic form, this concept threatens to make a saintly figure out of Havel, along the lines of someone like Jan Hus or Martin Luther, who carries the torch of the recognized or revealed truth in the face of adversity and at a great personal risk until it prevails. There is obviously something of the same integrity and courage in Havel, but in his thinking, living in truth is something which is simultaneously simpler and more complex. It is, as Havel analyzes in detail in the letters to Olga, not only about being faithful to an external truth, external idea, but also about being faithful to oneself, being comfortable with oneself, and with the whole of oneself, including one's own imperfections, flaws, and failures. In one of the key passages, at least for me, in the letters to Olga, he writes, quote, "It is not hard to stand behind one's successes, but to accept responsibility for one's failures, to accept them unreservedly as failures that are truly one's own, that cannot be shifted somewhere else or onto something else, and actively to accept without regard for any worldly interests, no matter how well disguised or for well-meant advice, the price that has to be paid for it, that is devilishly hard. But only thence does the road lead, as my experience, I hope, has persuaded me." And he wrote the whole passage in the aftermath of what he perceived as his personal failure, signing a very innocuous paper put to him by the police during one of the incarceration, which later the police tried to use against him as an evidence of his conforming or collaboration. So he writes, "As my experience, I hope, has persuaded me, the road leads to a renewal of sovereignty over my own affairs, to a radically new insight into the mysterious gravity of my existence as an uncertain enterprise and to its transcendental meaning. And only this kind of inner understanding can ultimately lead to what might be called true peace of mind, to that highest delight, to genuine meaningfulness, to that endless joy of being. If one manages to achieve that, then all one's worldly privations cease to be privations and become what Christians call grace." And I think this is very central to Havel, and this is also why counterintuitively, he sometimes does something that other people would perceive as not necessary or harmful to him or harmful to himself, etc., including the question that has been mentioned, why he stayed for as long as he did. And I think what Tim said makes a lot of sense from Havel's point of view. From the country's point of view, on the other hand, it doesn't. I mean, Havel was elected Czech president at a time when the country started from scratch, when after the split of Czechoslovakia, with very few certainties in terms of what lies ahead. And he was elected for the fourth time during one of the biggest economic and moral crises of our postmodern, our post-November period. I'm sorry about the postmodern period. Something that he himself called the blbá nálada, the ugly mood, the dumb mood. I don't know, maybe someone has a better translation. And at that point, you know, it was very important for people, even people who did not agree with Havel, that he'd be elected president again. And I have to make a small correction here. Jacques saw me raising my eyebrows when he talked about the elections in 1992 and Havel's friends, people who he supported losing. Well, he's partly right. I mean, they were his friends, but partly wrong. He didn't support them. I mean, Havel went on the record before the election in 1992 supporting the party of current President Klaus, the ODS, which was not, there were not too many friends of his in that party, and all his personal friends were in the party that lost. For all that, he supported the ODS, and I think it shows that at times he did show some sense for real politics too. So this concept of living in truth as an internal state of harmony is more modest and at the same time more ambitious than a devotion to an external idea or ideology of people like Luther. It is also something strewn with uncertainty, doubts, permanent soul-searching, and a hefty dose of skepticism and humor, and I'm very glad that Tim remarked on that, about absolute or unchangeable truth. And nowhere is this better illustrated than in the play and the film of Leaving, where Havel parodies some of the sacrosanct slogans of the Velvet Revolution, including the slogan, "Love and truth must prevail over lies and hatred," which he himself invented at the spur of the moment during, you know, one of the demonstrations at Manchester Square. And my third and last point is that it's about the visionary aspect. Is that although Havel was far-seeing in maintaining the resistance to the regime against all odds and in a number of other ways, he simply lacked the monomaniacal, I can't pronounce it, monomaniacal certainty of a true visionary. It was not just that he was personally conspicuously modest, as Tim said, diffident, even shy, but that his vision of the world was also modest and marked by humility. In fact, much of his critique of the contemporary Western civilization and culture that Jacques mentioned, both east and west of the former Iron Curtain, was derived from what he saw as arrogance and hubris of enlightened reason, from distrust of every kind of exclusive ownership of the truth. This humility was also at the core of Havel's transcendental, rather than purely religious feelings, full of awe and respect for the deeper mysteries of life and human existence. And this humility also helps explain why he was so cautious in his predictions of the fall of communism, and so reluctant to pass any definitive judgment on history, the present, the past, and the future. Into the Castle and Back the book, a very original book of memoirs that he wrote in 2007, he writes, and I quote, "Life is beautiful because, among other things, it is unpredictable and you can never be completely prepared for what comes along. I have to laugh when we are sometimes rebuked for being unprepared for our revolution, for not having a new democratic constitution and all the other essential legislation already written, and even for having no idea who would be minister of what, and so on. I find people who are completely prepared for history rather suspect. They have a lot in common with the communists who so arrogantly believe they have completely understood the world and therefore knew perfectly how everything should be. And then, when everything turns out to be slightly different, they try to squeeze the world to fit their notion. So if Havel lived in truth, it was not because he found it, but because he kept searching for it. It is a rather modest kind of vision, but it makes me very, very proud for having known him, and I think it is the right kind of vision for our times. Now, before I conclude, I somehow feel I owe an anecdote too, because there should be always an anecdote when people speak about Havel, and Tim spoke about his theatrical perception, his sense of theater, his sense of politics as theater, and he did mention the 2002 NATO summit in Prague, and that Havel concentrated on every detail of the ceremony, maybe more than on some of the subjects that were being discussed at the summit, and the result of that was a grand performance, a show including a ballet by Kilian and a medley of music consisting of some Beatles songs and the Ode to Joy by Beethoven and a few other great pieces of music. And about a month before it all happened, I did spend a part of my early life, I'm ashamed to admit, as a lyricist, as writing songs. And so he asked me to write an English lyrics for the Ode to Joy. And a new English lyric, there exists an English lyric for it. And I said, but you know, look, I mean, this is Schiller, this is Beethoven. I don't feel comfortable doing it. And he looked at me and asked, you know, have you ever had a song of yours performed in front of 48 heads of state? I wrote the lyrics.